In this video, I'm going to focus on the philosopher Max Scheler's break with Christianity, which happened around 1922. This follows from my recent video about the philosophy he developed after his break and outlined in his book The Human Place in the Cosmos, which was his final book published before he died in 1928. While I'll try to give an overview of this in the present video, I'd highly recommend checking out that previous one if you want to understand it in more depth. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Max Scheler was a German philosopher who was a key figure in the phenomenological movement, phenomenology being, to put it simply, the study of experience as it is given to us. His most significant philosophical contributions were probably his material value ethics, the theory that ethics is grounded in an ordered multiplicity of directly intuitable values, and his ethical personalism, the idea that complete persons are at the heart of ethical life and of paramount value. I also made an earlier video on his ethics, or at least an aspect of his ethics, namely the hierarchical ordering of values, so I'll put a link to that in the description as well. In addition to his ethics, he also made major contributions on the theory of ressentiment or resentment, the phenomenology of religion, theories of feeling, sympathy, intersubjectivity, and love, and later on the sociology of knowledge and philosophical anthropology. Despite his later abandonment of the church, he's remembered as a key contributor to modern Christian, and in particular Catholic, religious thought. This is in large part due to Pope John Paul II, who was heavily influenced by Scheler's personalist ethics. His life and thought can be divided into 2 or 3 periods. The particular scheme differs depending on who writes about him. If we consider 3 periods, there's an initial pre-phenomenological period, a middle period steeped in phenomenology and Christian religious thinking, and a final post-Christian period with a pronounced focus on metaphysics and the nature of the human being. If we consider only 2 periods, there's everything that came before the shift away from Christianity around 1922, and everything that came after. This shift was therefore likely the most significant of Scheler's life, though his discovery of phenomenology at the turn of the century, his conversion to Catholic Christianity, and certain events in his romantic life could also be contenders. We'll get into the details of these when we look at the course of his life more closely. In this video, I aim to explore the meaning and significance of Scheler's break with Christianity, and I mean this in a few ways. So firstly, I hope to shed some light on why this shift occurred. There are certain personal factors that likely played a role, though there are also philosophical reasons for the change as well. Secondly, I want to understand how the worldview he came to after the break relates to the Christian worldview that he left. In other words, to put it starkly, is it better or worse? Is it a progression onward from Christian insights that have been assimilated and surpassed, or a falling away, a falling back from insights that were never fully comprehended? To put it in still another way, does Scheler's late thought represent a genuinely post-Christian philosophy? And thirdly, I want to understand what all of this means for the relationship between philosophy and religion themselves as distinct approaches to wisdom or to being. Scheler's thought, and therefore the change in his thought, has deep personal significance to me. His book on ethics was one of the spurs that brought me back to Christianity, the religion of my birth, for a time in my early 20s, after having effectively abandoned it in my early teens. And this was specifically Catholic Christianity, the same form that Scheler embraced. I remember that summer in which my attraction to Christianity was building to a crest, walking around with that book in a kind of ecstasy, reading about how values are, after all, objective, really there, and find their highest expression in the Christian religion. To my previously nihilistic mind, Scheler showed me a world rich in meaning and value, and he showed me, along with other authors I was reading at the time, that Christianity could be both deeply beautiful and intellectually profound. It seems Scheler had a similar influence on others back when he was speaking and writing and developing these ideas in the 1910s. The philosopher Edith Stein, who would go on to become the Catholic saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, encountered him in the midst of his Catholic period while he was still an atheist, deeply skeptical of religion. While she was still an atheist, deeply skeptical of religion. In her autobiography, she describes the effect of her encounter with him. Quote, "He was quite full of Catholic ideas at the time, and employed all the brilliance of his spirit and his eloquence to plead them. This was my first encounter with this hitherto totally unknown world. It did not lead me as yet to the faith, but it did open for me a region of phenomena which I could then no longer bypass blindly. The barriers of rationalistic prejudices with which I had unwittingly grown up fell, and the world of faith unfolded before me." End quote. In my own case, though Scheler opened my mind to Christianity and helped instill a deep respect for and fascination with it, in the many years since that enchanted summer, I've only committed myself to it completely and unconditionally for very brief periods of time. Mostly I've maintained a kind of awkward relationship with it, practicing it alongside other religious practices while holding other philosophical beliefs with all sorts of practical and intellectual qualifications. I always knew that Scheler eventually left the church and developed his philosophy in a different direction, but I never looked into the details of this until very recently, though it's been something I'd been wanting to do for a long time. Obviously, the fact that this man, who had such an influence on me, who argued so persuasively for a Christian worldview, that this man left the church and altered his worldview, seems immensely significant to my own religious struggles. Was this due to personal weakness and vice, or intellectual courage and integrity? Was what he found beyond the church of any worth? But I feel that Scheler's shift has wider significance today than only for my personal experience, because it seems like the trajectory I took, or at least the start of that trajectory, from a kind of reductive nihilism towards meaning and faith, is a very common one at the moment. Individuals like Jordan Peterson have had a huge impact, and it seems like people are flocking back to religion, and especially to the more traditional forms of it. It has an intellectual respectability and appeal that it didn't have just a couple of decades ago. So the questions Scheler's break with Christianity sparked for me may also have relevance to others who have felt, perhaps with a mixture of joy and distrust, the renewed pull towards this religion, or toward any traditional religion. I think especially of those like myself who, despite an immense sympathy for it, have not unconditionally embraced it, but instead have a more complicated, liminal relationship to it. Peterson himself comes to mind as an example of this, and perhaps in a slightly different way, John Vervaeke. Before I get into why the shift in Scheler's thought occurred, I should briefly outline his worldview before versus his worldview after the shift. So theologically, his position from around 1915 until around 1922 was more or less consonant with the Catholic Church. God is an all-powerful spirit who created the universe out of nothing for the sake of love. God and man are distinct, though man can grow closer to God and, in a sense, more and more like God. And it is the God-man, Jesus Christ, who mediates our salvation. Epistemologically, he held that the irreducible essences that phenomenology discloses to us are genuinely there, are objective, independent of any human mind. Likewise, the values that one discovers in ethical reflection are truly, so to speak, out there, waiting to be apprehended through emotive acts such as love, feeling, and preferring. We tend to see these things as subjective, but Scheler shows how they're really unique forms of perception. This was the core of his approach to ethics, and where there was always a little tension with the church was between his emotive, intuitionistic approach centered on the heart as the core of one's ethical being, versus the somewhat more rationalistic, mind-centered Thomism, which was the official philosophy of the church. Having said that, Pope John Paul II would later fuse these two perspectives in the philosophy of Thomistic personalism, but generally Scheler's philosophy throughout the middle throughout his middle period aligned closely with the Church. By the end of his life, however, Scheler believed in a kind of pantheism, or slightly more accurately, a panentheism, though neither of these terms perfectly captures his position. Pantheism is the equation of God and the world, while panentheism is the idea that, though the world is God, God also transcends the world. If you imagine two nested circles, God is the larger. But Scheler's position was more complex. He believed there was one absolute, holy, though non-personal, ground of being, of which we know two attributes: Drang, which can be translated as impulsion, and Geist, which is translated as spirit. In one sense, these two principles are in a fundamental tension. In another sense, they are complementary. Drang is the thrust or force which animates the universe, from the most basic quantum particles to the most complex operations of the human brain. Geist, on the other hand, is the order of essences inherent in being, as well as the ability to apprehend them. Latent in Geist is the Deitas, the deity or God, who as pure spirit is purely potential and has not yet come into reality. To put it simply, Geist is originally powerless, and Drang is originally blind. But in the human being, these two principles achieve their maximal interpenetration through the process of sublimation, a term Scheler borrowed from Freud, meaning the turning of basic psychological energy to spiritual ends. Geist cannot directly control Drang, but it can have an indirect influence by directing and steering the raw energy of Drang, placing before it attractive ideas and images, and temporarily inhibiting or disinhibiting certain drives. Thus the energy of life comes to serve spirit, and the ideas of spirit become incarnate, effective, real. And in this process of interpenetration that occurs in the human being, God, who is purely potential as pure Geist, God gradually comes into being. So the personal God doesn't exist as a real being before the creation of the universe, and he certainly didn't create it, but he does come into being through the process of its development, and particularly in and through the human being. Rather than the complete and eternal God of traditional theism, he is, in Scheler's words, a God in becoming. As for traditional religion, it is an attempt, conditioned by the human need for protection, to fill out the realm of the absolute with a being or beings to pray to in order to receive comfort, help, and defense. While virtually unavoidable for a time, it is something we can now surpass, and may already be surpassing, in favor of a better relation with the absolute, a non-objectifying metaphysical wonder, and willingness to act for and cooperate with the God who is coming to be through us. Now, that's very much the nutshell version. Again, I recommend checking out my recent video in which I go into Scheler's late philosophy in depth. In that video, you'll see that I qualify some of the things I've said here, which I've had to kind of oversimplify for this introduction. And I also address some criticisms and some questions in that video, some of which I think I have answers for, while others still leave me perplexed. But with that said, let's proceed. So for this video, the first question we have to ask is, why did this shift in Scheler's thought occur? But to begin to understand that, we'll first have to understand the other events of his life. Now, before I dive into Scheler's biography, I just want to note that I've got much of this information from a book by John Raphael Stelter called Max Scheler, An Intellectual Portrait, published in 1967. It's the only book-length biography in the English language I could get my hands on. In fact, it's freely available to read on Internet Archive, and I'll include a link to it in the description. Stelter draws on interviews with numerous people who knew him, but more crucially on information from Scheler's second wife, Marit, which includes letters he wrote to her following their separation and his eventual marriage to his final wife, Maria. Though Marit was forthcoming, Stauder notes that Maria was reluctant to disclose any information about Scheler's life. What gives me pause isn't the sources, but the spirit in which the book is written. It is essentially an attempt to explain the changes in Scheler's thought as motivated, on the one hand, by personal factors and on the other by social factors, namely class relations and the various ideological enthusiasms of early 20th century Germany. At no point does Stauder seem to take Scheler's thought seriously on its own terms, or consider that the changes it underwent were spurred by genuine intellectual considerations, and the tone throughout the book is one of contempt. The author has little sympathy and seemingly no love for Scheler, and yet I agree with Scheler that love discloses reality, and we cannot truly understand someone unless we first, in a way, love them, even if we disagree with their ideas or actions. So all this makes me suspicious of Stauder's book, even though I'm going to assume that all the main facts in it are correct. Max Scheler was born in Munich in 1874 to a Jewish mother. There appears to be some debate whether his father converted to Judaism upon marriage or whether he retained his Protestant faith. In any case, the young Scheler was effectively a Jew and appears to have attended synagogue with his mother and uncle every Saturday. At age 14, he shocked his family by converting to Catholicism, in part due to the influence of a Catholic high school chaplain. This was his initial conversion, but he would soon fall away from the practice of that faith. Shortly after graduation from high school, he began a liaison with the woman who would become his first wife, Amelie von Duetz. She was 8 years his senior and married to another man at the time. Scheler completed his PhD at the University of Jena in 1897 and his postdoctoral habilitation at the same university in 1899, where he then began teaching. According to some sources, he and Amelie finally married that year, though Stauder places their marriage earlier, in 1895. In 1901, Scheler met the philosopher Edmund Husserl, who is considered to be the founder of phenomenology. He met him at a party. The following year, he read Husserl's book, Logical Investigations. Scheler felt Husserl's developing phenomenological method and phenomenological approach to philosophy to be a far more fruitful approach than previous ones, and gradually integrated it into his own work. In 1906, Scheler left Jena and took up a post at the University of Munich. According to Stauder's book, this was triggered by a scandal in which Amelie slapped a married woman at a social function and publicly accused her of having an affair with her husband. Within a year of the move, Max and Amelie Scheler separated. However, Amelie conceived a way to avenge herself for his infidelities. She informed the Munich newspaper that he had gone into debt to pay for his affairs with other women, leaving herself and their children in poverty. The scandal this generated led to a formal investigation by the University of Munich in 1910, which resulted in him being deprived of the right to teach at any German university. From an official perspective, his academic career was over. It was at this point that Scheler was forced to become, in essence, an independent scholar, a role he'd remain in until 1919. He moved to the university town of Göttingen, where Husserl was teaching, and made a living through publishing books and articles and holding private lectures. Later, he moved to Berlin, but would still travel to Göttingen for several weeks to lecture. It was here that Edith Stein met him, and she notes in her autobiography how his lectures could neither be held on university grounds nor even advertised on his bulletin boards, but knowledge of them was spread by word of mouth among the students. Apparently, a great deal of tension developed between Scheler and Husserl, although previously they were friendly, partly due to their differences in temperament. Scheler was more passionate, charismatic, and chaotic, Husserl more subdued and scholarly, but perhaps also because he saw Scheler as stealing his students and fracturing the phenomenological movement. While still in Munich, Scheler had fallen in love with married Furtwängler, who would become his second wife. They wanted to get married, but Scheler was still technically married to Amelie, who, although separated from him, was reluctant to agree to a divorce. Eventually, according to Stauder's biography, she announced she would consent to a divorce on the condition that Scheler pay her a huge sum of money by a certain date, which Scheler only just managed to do with the help of Married's inheritance. So in 1912, he divorced Amelie and married Married, a marriage bitterly opposed by Married's family due to Scheler's scandalous reputation. The following year, he published the first volume of his book on ethics, Formalism in Ethics and Material Ethics of Values, the book that so fascinated me that summer of my early 20s. The second and final volume was published in 1916. Like Scheler, Married was Catholic, and unlike his first marriage, theirs was a sacramental marriage conducted in a Catholic church. He had long since ceased actively practicing the religion he adopted at age 14, but it seems his Catholic bride may have begun the process that brought him back to it as he subsequently began studying the early church fathers. Then, in 1915, while visiting a Benedictine abbey, he made a general confession and fully rejoined the life of the church. From this point until his final break with the Catholic Church 7 or 8 years later, he would be a vocal champion of it on the philosophical and cultural stage. At the outbreak of World War I, Scheler wrote a book called The Genius of War, which was published in 1915. Though I haven't read it, it apparently praises war as a revivifying force, and in that sense reflects the massive optimism in Germany at that time that the war would be short and glorious. The book was a big success and made him popular among the general public. By the middle of the war, however, his stance appears to have changed, and he was advocating both for peace and for a united Europe in its aftermath. In 1919, he finally returned to official academia, accepting a position at the University of Cologne. Its rector had been willing to overlook the scandal of his past. While at Cologne, he wrote the bulk of his book on religion, The Eternal in Man, which was published in 1921. At some point, he fell in love with a young woman, Maria Scheu, who he met at an intellectual salon. For her part, she was extremely taken with him and enrolled in one of his classes. His wife, Married, seems to have been aware of the affair, and according to Stauder's biography, by 1922, his new love, Maria, was forcing an ultimatum: divorce Married and marry me, or I'll leave you. Though Scheler appears to have still loved Married and was torn by the decision, he chose Maria. Max Scheler married his third and final wife in 1924 in a civil ceremony. By this time, his break with the church was complete. Leaving aside for now the question of what caused the break, it's a fact that the Catholic Church does not recognize divorce. Having abandoned the Catholic wife to whom he was wed in a sacramental marriage and having taken a new wife, he was now openly living in sin and would be denied communion. While nowadays, in the West at least, the Catholic Church turns a blind eye to this type of thing, back then they took it very seriously. Regardless of his real motivations for his break with the church, Scheler would not have been able to continue in it as a fully participating member, nor would he be taken seriously as a Catholic thinker. And to make matters worse, according to Stauder's book, the Catholic clergy explicitly forbade Catholic students to attend his lectures. In 1927, Scheler accepted an offer of a position at the University of Frankfurt and moved to that city the following year. By now he had developed his new philosophy, which had informed his work on the sociology of knowledge, published in 1926. While he was planning the books that would systematically lay out his new thought, he delivered a lecture on it at Count Hermann von Keyserling's School of Wisdom. Shortly after, he turned this 3 or 4 hour lecture into a brief book titled The Human Place in the Cosmos, which was published just before he died. Though essentially just a sketch, it's the most complete account we have of Scheler's late thought. In May 1928, he suffered a severe heart attack and was taken to hospital. A few days later, he passed away. So that's an outline of Scheler's life. What stands out from this is his love affairs, his initial involvement with the married Amelie, his apparent infidelities to her when she was his wife, a scandal that barred him from teaching for many years, his infidelity to his next wife, Marriott, and his final abandonment of her for Maria, a marriage which effectively barred his continued participation in the Catholic Church. Many have argued that here we have the cause of Scheler's break with Christianity. He finally separated from Marriott in March 1923. In his book on Scheler's ethical personalism, Peter Spader notes that we find the first public reference to his growing distance from the Church in December 1923. So to put it bluntly, it's plausible to conclude that Scheler abandoned the Church philosophically simply because he could not or would not conform to it ethically, personally. This finds support from an essay published by his friend Dietrich von Hildebrand shortly after his death, titled The Personality of Max Scheler. Von Hildebrand was an important thinker in his own right. He shared Scheler's phenomenological orientation and further developed his material value ethics. Due to Scheler's influence, he himself had converted to Catholicism in 1914, though unlike Scheler, he remained loyal to it for the rest of his life. Von Hildebrand's essay paints a picture of a deeply gifted, intuitive philosopher, someone who could immediately grasp great depths of meaning in everyday encounters. His philosophy sprang from his living contact with reality. He had an incredible charisma, something about which there seems to be a consensus among those who knew him. Both he and Stein report being fascinated upon their first encounter with him. He had an enormous philosophical fruitfulness, a unique and abundant kindness for others, a noble generosity, and could never remain angry even when treated with real injustice. However, the bulk of the essay gives a more negative assessment of the man. He was impatient and restless, ever seeking new insights and impressions, and this was to the detriment of both his personal life and his philosophical work, the latter never being as rigorous as it should have been. Von Hildebrand diagnoses the tragic flaw he finds in Scheler's personality. Quote, Scheler's thought was not characterized by the desire to possess truth, but rather by the delight in coming into cognitive contact with interesting and significant phenomena. He was filled with an unquenchable thirst to be always discovering something new, to be always uncovering some new aspect of reality. This was connected with the tragic restlessness of Scheler as a person. He could not rest in the possession of the truth. He could not give himself over with heart and will to the known object. End quote. Von Hildebrand discounts his philosophical work after 1922. He discounts it and he calls it the period of his philosophical decline, despite him being just as popular during this period, if not more so, and certainly more original. For von Hildebrand, after his break with the Church, quote, everything became more and more artificial, more and more subjective, more and more opaque and ungenuine, because in place of an unimpeded philosophical vision, there appeared the desperate flight of a shattered man from his guilty conscience. End quote. He goes as far as to speak of the demonic in Scheler, specifically in, quote, the way in which this noble and rich personality was devastated by the raw strength of his unbridled drives, which increased the discontinuity of his life and accelerated his search for new impressions, end quote. But immediately he somewhat qualifies this, quote, but his giving in to his urges had also something childish about it. There was a childish streak in his opposition to all binding authority, and the need to begin anew every day. Whoever did not penetrate to Scheler's lovable naivete did not understand him fully. End quote. In the final paragraph of his essay, he remarks, quote, his sudden death cut off the restless, broken life of this noble, lavishly gifted spirit before he could stop in his impotent flight from the one who knows our sitting and our rising. End quote. And he expresses the hope that God has somehow intercepted him in his flight and will lead his soul fully to the light of truth. though harsh. Von Hildebrand's essay betrays a basic love that is lacking in Stauder's book. But of course, von Hildebrand knows a greater love for God and the Church, and it's impossible for me not to see this as colouring his assessment of Scheler's life and thought. For von Hildebrand, the truth and the teachings of the Catholic Church coincide. Any deviation from the latter must be a deviation from the former, and moreover, utterly conditioned by sin. Von Hildebrand's specific preoccupation with Christian truth is evident when he lists in the middle of the essay a few examples of Scheler's lack of seriousness in the search for truth. He once called a particular priest brilliant, yet cold, wicked, and heartless, an assessment von Hildebrand disagreed with and tried unsuccessfully to disabuse him of. He dared to suggest St. Paul showed traces of ressentiment in his study of that phenomenon. And he claimed that Christianity didn't understand the love of nature before St. Francis of Assisi. Now, we don't know the priest, but I'd say the last two claims, though debatable, are far from self-evidently wrong. In any case, for von Hildebrand, it's not simply Scheler's divorce that was the cause of his break with the Church, but the tragic restlessness that lay behind it. I don't doubt there's much truth in his description of Scheler's personality, even when I factor in his deep allegiance to Christianity. Although I see a lot of worth in Scheler's late philosophical work, and don't believe the final years of his life can be characterized as a dark, guilty flight from God, nevertheless, it does seem that his divorce precipitated his break with the Church, and that his personality led to the divorce, just as it had led to his first divorce and to his extramarital affairs. Here we find ourselves face to face with the problem of eros. I use this term for a few related reasons. First, because it can be seen as standing midway between a highly spiritual love and mere sensuality, erotic love as opposed to sexual desire. While I could be wrong, it seems to me that Scheler's love affairs were of a more than merely sensual nature, that the women weren't simply interchangeable, but that he really loved each of them in the sense of passionate infatuation. At the very least, this seems true of his 3 wives. And the second reason I use this term is its philosophical connotations as an energy with the power to draw us higher. When considering this problem, we first of all need to guard against an overly hasty and basically self-righteous condemnation. Condemnation is easy, and even more than easy, when we ourselves are not facing temptation, perhaps because we lack the natural charisma or attractiveness to even have the luxury of temptation, let alone its overcoming. Scheler appears to have been gifted or afflicted with this charisma. We should also remember all the ways that eros is good. After all, it is our natural response to beauty. It vivifies the soul. It fascinates us with others and thereby draws our attention and regard away from ourselves toward other beings. It spurs, inspires, motivates all kinds of creative activity. It is entwined with joy and play, and of course it promotes the continuance of life through the generations. In its deeper and more philosophical sense of fundamental desire or life force, it could be argued to underlie everything that we do, from the obvious examples of romantic courtship through all the forms of higher culture to the heights of religious experience and worship. In Plato's Symposium, it is the force that animates philosophy. And in Scheler's own final philosophy, eros has a key place, a fact I didn't discover until I had already written this section. Based on the notes he made for his book that was never published, that he intended to publish on his philosophical anthropology and metaphysics, eros is the particular movement of drang that unites us sympathetically with all life and prepares the way for spiritual insight to disclose the essences and values of the world. This is because, unlike the drives for nutrition and power, it is inherently oriented towards the being of the other. While this originally serves the purposes of life through reproduction, its energy is uniquely amenable to the influence of spirit. In the best case, This upward movement of life cooperates with agape, the downward movement of spirit. So we should remember that with eros we are dealing with something immensely powerful, incredibly sweet, often exceedingly positive, and probably indispensable. At the same time, this shouldn't blind us to its negative aspects. The madness inherent in infatuation, the addiction, consuming thirst, jealousy, and overwhelming selfishness that demands possession of the beloved regardless of the impact on others, and the way it can seem to blot out any higher values. Religion rightly sees it as its great enemy, and it's no surprise that a chief archetype of sin is erotic desire. So there's a second extreme we need to guard ourselves against, a too casual and soft-hearted acceptance. If we turn back to the case of Scheler, his life appears to be riddled with a string of infidelities, a string of betrayals. These had real and terrible impact on the woman he claimed to love and pledged to love always in marriage. And his unbridled eros betrayed itself in a way by time and time again abandoning these women, preventing the fascinating infatuation from ripening into a full and lasting love. The restless eros that initially disclosed their worth eventually thwarted itself from fulfilling its own movement of love for the person herself. And so Scheler became a liar, an adulterer, and wounded those he was most bound to care for. And it dragged him down away from the higher values that he recognized as higher. In his own understanding, the spiritual values of moral rectitude, let us say fidelity and marriage, are superior to the vital values of eros. And higher than this, the value of the holy is superior to all other values. Reverence for God, the absolute being, at the expense, if necessary, of everything else. Even if we were to assume his views of God and religion were already changing, it's hard for me to see how, in his choice between eros for his mistress and faithfulness to his wife, that the values of the holy were found on the side of eros. If he did still believe in the doctrines of his church, the situation becomes much worse. Now, as far as I'm aware, we never find Scheler proposing polygamy or intellectually defending free love, so it's quite probable that he knew what he did was wrong, but felt himself powerless to resist it. Considering this, it's possible that Scheler's personal struggle with eros not only led to his break with the church, but conditioned the philosophy that came after it. In this philosophy, spirit is, in itself, powerless against impulsion. We cannot directly control our drives. We can at best guide them in better directions through the mental representations we place before them, combined with a tactical inhibition or disinhibition. This is the sublimation by which spirit and impulsion interpenetrate in the human being, the means by which spirit slowly gains more and more power and reality. Scheler seems to be speaking from experience when he says on page 49 of The Human Place in the Cosmos, quote, "A direct struggle of will against the powers of drives, that is, a struggle without said holding of ideas before them so that they may turn to or reject the representations, is impossible. On the contrary, when such a struggle is attempted intentionally, the drives are even more in their own one-sided direction. St. Paul had already experienced this when he said that the law was roaming about like a roaring lion to attack those humans who have sinned." End quote. Now, it turns out that St. Paul didn't quite say this. Rather, it seems to be a conflation of 1 Peter 5:8, which says, "The devil prowls around like a roaring lion," with the overall message of Romans 7, in which the law seems to arouse in us the very sins it condemns. Scheler continues, willing always produces the opposite of what it wills when, instead of intending a higher value whose realization makes us forget what is bad and attracts human energies, it directs itself instead to a mere fight against and negation of a drive whose goal appears to our conscience as bad. Thus, the human being, also has to learn how to tolerate himself. Even those inclinations which he recognizes to be bad and pernicious, he should not fight them directly, but learn to overcome them indirectly by mobilizing his energies toward valuable tasks known by his conscience to be good and proper and possible for him to achieve. End quote. There are a few things that we should observe here. It may be that one of the most remarkable qualities of Scheler's late thought, namely the essential impotence of spirit, is an expression of Scheler's own futile struggle against his erotic drives. He has experienced that a direct fight with his drives never works, but only seems to make things worse, and concludes it must be in the nature of spirit itself to be incapable of this kind of feat. This is a uniquely personal issue, we might say, blown up into a theory of being itself, the issue of either abnormally strong drives, a unique weakness of will, or a desire to excuse his own bad choices. But on the other hand, is he expressing something merely personal or something universal? How much can we really achieve by sheer force of will alone? When we think we have done so, might it not really have been through the mediation of representations, particularly some positive image that inspires us? Assuming, of course, that the victory wasn't only temporary and our suppressed passions didn't flare up later with greater force some other way. And this basic insight into human experience isn't especially new. After all, he cites the Apostle Paul in support of it. Indeed, in the qualified Pauline sense, it's one of the central insights of Christianity. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot deliver ourselves from sin. The Christian answer to this dilemma may also align with Scheler's proposal. Instead of striving to stifle all sin, we must turn our attention to a higher value whose realization makes us forget what is bad and attracts human energies. This is the example of Christ, and perhaps even more so, the boundless love of God for us expressed through Christ. It's this that was felt to liberate from sin, where all legalistic striving failed. Now, Scheler goes further than this because in Christianity it's only human spirit that is impotent against sin. And this degree of impotence itself varies considerably if you compare, for instance, Calvinism with Eastern Orthodoxy. But God, the absolute spirit, is all-powerful. So there's a real difference here. For Scheler, absolute spirit is powerless. We'll get into some philosophical reasons for this shortly. So we might say of Paul, he displaces his personal impotence against sin onto the fallen nature of humanity itself, though Scheler goes further and displaces it onto God himself. But we might also say both Paul and Scheler are correct, that a direct struggle against the drives is futile, though the metaphysical conclusions they draw from this are different. Finally, I just want to highlight what Scheler says about learning to tolerate ourselves, even those inclinations we recognize to be bad and pernicious. We could read this as merely a self-excusing, a giving oneself permission to do whatever one wills. Undoubtedly, many do say things like this to themselves or others, merely to excuse themselves. But we could also hear in it a profound wisdom, born of personal experience with fruitless struggle and more fruitful self-toleration. I tend to see it in this light. It's unfortunate that we cannot penetrate into Scheler's inner experience to know which meaning it had for him, because, to emphasize the point once again, something like this can be either utterly toxic or completely edifying, depending on the person. I do think it's notable that Scheler's ethical philosophy never changes. As I'll talk about shortly, he explicitly states this in a preface to his book on ethics after his change in metaphysics. He continues to believe in an absolute hierarchy of objective values, directly accessible to a form of intuition, even after his metaphysical and theological views have altered, even after he's left his second wife for his third. Values don't suddenly become for him relative or subjective, as they might well have done if his main concern was to justify or excuse his bad behavior. Indeed, about his divorce, he doesn't seem to have felt for the rest of... about his divorce, he does seem to have felt, for the rest of his life, a certain degree of guilt. For his book, Stauder draws on letters sent by Scheler to his second wife, Marit, though he says he has declined to quote from them out of respect for Scheler's surviving family. Nevertheless, from the way he describes them, it seems that Scheler still loved Marit for the rest of his life. They continued to exchange letters to the end, and would secretly meet, even after his marriage to Maria, their final meeting being the day before his fatal heart attack. The precise nature of these meetings isn't clarified by Stauder, though he doesn't suggest that they went beyond Platonic bounds. Nevertheless, it's striking that on the day of his wedding to Maria, he allegedly wrote to Marit that all day he'd been thinking only of her. Now, obviously this behavior isn't very respectful of Maria, and in that sense perhaps it only adds to his offences, but I do think it suggests a more complex situation than the callous, pleasure-driven discarding of one woman for another. It suggests rather a tortured conflict between two genuine loves, of at least a conflict of genuine eros. Considering all of this, my sense is that Scheler was well aware of his failings and genuinely struggled against the bad directions he felt himself pulled in by his drives. Again, since we cannot look inside his mind and heart, we cannot know the extent of this awareness and struggle. But in any case, if we hope to understand the change in his religious and metaphysical views, we can't stop at the personal, but must also consider the philosophical reasons for this change. A person may do something, join or leave an ideological or religious group, let's say, purely because it's expedient. The situation changes. They marry or divorce or find a circle of friends, and their ideological or religious allegiance changes accordingly. But it can also be the case that this change in outward circumstances is just the proximate cause, the final straw that leads them to make or withdraw that commitment. It may be that, deep within, their ideas and their faith have been gradually changing for a long time, only they remained reluctant to act on this until that last external push. This is one way to see Scheler's decision to leave the church. I have little doubt that his dedication to it was sincere during the days at the heart of his Catholic period, married to Marit. But had this faith already weakened by the time he divorced Marit and married Maria? Not aware of any direct evidence either way on this. As I mentioned before, his first public statement distancing himself from the church seems to have come at the end of 1923, the year he separated from Marit, but one would not be expected to make one's private doubts and questionings public, especially before one knew what one was going to do about them. But we do have one source that we can turn to, his philosophy. Is there something in Scheler's philosophy itself that necessitated the change in philosophy and thus in religious belief? This is to take Scheler seriously as a thinker, something that Peter Spader, in his book on Scheler's ethical personalism, does. And he laments that so many writers on Scheler have failed to do this. Instead, they tend to reductively attribute his change in thought to personal factors. This approach appears to have been strongly influenced by von Hildebrand's early essay on Scheler's personality, but as we've seen, von Hildebrand was strongly motivated to see it in this way. If it was because of Scheler's thought, if there was something compelling in his late philosophy, then there must be something lacking in the Holy Church. In a moment, I'll talk about some of the philosophical reasons for Scheler's break with the church, but first I want to look at another essay written by a friend of Scheler immediately after his death. This one, titled simply Max Scheler, was written by the philosopher Nikolai Hartmann. Like von Hildebrand, he highlights Scheler's incredible power of intuition and the direct contact his thinking had with life. But unlike Hildebrand, he sees Scheler's changeableness as a virtue rather than a vice. On his break with Christian theism and the scandal this caused among his Christian admirers, Hartmann remarks, quote, "The inner dynamic of his thought did not stand still. It inevitably led him further. what must have appeared to them like a breach of their fixed dogma was just plain philosophical consistency. The gravity of the problem of reality, which preoccupied him more and more year after year, coerced him toward a reorientation." End quote. And a little further on he says, Scheler's strength was his power of constant relearning, of steadfast metamorphosis and reorganization, the insouciance with which he abandoned his earlier claims as soon as they could no longer satisfy him and be adequate for the shifting problems of the time. It was precisely this that must have been the stumbling block for those unable to advance at the same pace. End quote. He calls Scheler a master of the fine art of progressive relearning, a gift that was possessed by only a few of the great thinkers of history, a list that includes Fichte, Schelling, Nietzsche, and Plato. In taking this path, says Hartmann, quote, Scheler's life and thought thus became an undeviating struggle and thrusting forward, and so at every step, this path was just a single great, undeviating, genuine, philosophical testimony to truth. End quote. So Hartmann has a very different estimation than von Hildebrand of Scheler's post-Christian work, though he doesn't himself adhere to it, although both he and von Hildebrand embraced and built upon Scheler's theory of values. But though Hartmann doesn't share Scheler's late philosophy, neither does he feel bound to denigrate it. Instead of a tragic fall, he sees a bold and earnest philosophical progression. Now, this isn't to say that his assessment of Scheler is right and von Hildebrand's is wrong, but just that the case is far from clear-cut. Two highly intelligent men who knew him well had these very different views about him. Hartmann claims that Scheler's break with Christianity was inevitable as a matter of plain philosophical consistency. So let's finally dive into what these philosophical reasons for the change might be. An excellent book on this topic is one I've already referred to a couple of times in this video. It's called Max Scheler's Ethical Personalism by Peter Spader. In chapters 7 and 8, Spader gravels with the reasons for the change. He draws attention to Scheler's own comments about it. In his 1926 preface to the third edition of the Formalism in Ethics and Material Ethics of Values, which we'll refer to from now on simply as the Formalism, in the preface to the third edition of this, he acknowledges that since he wrote that book, his views on fundamental issues of metaphysics and theology have changed. Nevertheless, he goes on to say, quote, "It appears to me all the more necessary, however, to stress here that the ideas in this work not only remain unaffected by the change in my fundamental metaphysical position, but represent some of the reasons and intellectual motives which led to the change." End quote. He then remarks that if changes were to be made to the book, it would only be to the chapter titled Microcosm, Macrocosm, and the Idea of God. So not only would the vast bulk of this earlier work still stand, but he tells us straightforwardly that it contains some of the intellectual reasons for his subsequent change in views. But what are they? Spader traces two basic problems that have their genesis in this work but come to fruition in his book on religion, published towards the end of his Catholic period, titled On the Eternal in Man. The problems are, first, the distinction between the real and the unreal, or more specifically between a realized and an unrealized value. And secondly, the problem of evil, how the world as it is relates to God and his perfection. Both these problems have their origin in Scheler's book on ethics, because in that work he develops the idea that the moral values of good and evil aren't like other values which can be directly willed by a person. Instead, they pertain to him only when he realizes a higher value rather than a lower, or a positive value rather than a negative value. Here's exactly how Scheler puts it on page 25 of the Formalism. Quote, "The value good, in an absolute sense, is the value that appears by way of essential necessity on the act of realizing the value which, with respect to the measure of cognition of the being which realizes it, is the highest. The value evil, in an absolute sense, is the value that appears on the act of realizing the lowest value. The value that appears on the act which is aimed towards realizing a higher or lower value, as viewed from the initial value experiencing in every case, is relatively good or evil." End quote. And finally, a little further on, quote, "Second, the value good is the value that is attached to the act which realizes a positive value, as opposed to a negative value, within the higher or highest level of value ranks. The value evil is the one that is attached to the act which realizes a negative value." End quote. For Scheler, values have an intrinsic order of rank among themselves. For example, spiritual values are higher than vital values, and vital values are higher than sensual values. And then within each level there are positive and negative values. For example, on the level of spiritual values, there is the beautiful as opposed to the ugly. On the level of sensual values, the agreeable opposed to the disagreeable. Take a look at my previous video on Scheler's hierarchy of values for more on this. Though in that video, I have to say I unfortunately neglected to explain how moral values, strictly speaking, are unique in not being able to be directly willed. And I may have confused the matter by referring to the spiritual values of right versus wrong as moral values. So if you check out that video, just so that is clear. To understand why, for Scheler, the genuine moral values of good and evil can never be directly willed, we just need to consider whether what this would look like in practice. Scheler uses the following example, quote, "For instance, he who does not want to do good to his fellow man in such a way that he becomes concerned about the realization of his fellow man's weal, but who merely seizes the opportunity to be good or to do good in this act, neither is good nor does good. He is truly an example of a Pharisee who wishes to appear good to himself. The value good appears by our realizing a higher positive value given in preferring. This value appears on the act of willing. It is located, so to speak, on the back of this act, and this by way of essential necessity. It can therefore never be intended in this act." End quote. Any direct attempt to be good undermines itself. The goodness of an act lies in the genuine willing of a higher or a positive value. If I do not will this, goodness escapes me. Furthermore, though we've been speaking in terms of acts, Scheler later clarifies that the moral values of good and evil pertain primarily or originally to the person. Secondarily, they apply to what he calls the directions of his moral to be able to, or in other words, his virtues and vices. And only in the third place are the bearers of good and evil, the acts of the person. The reason for this structure is that for Scheler, the person is the concrete unity of his acts. So while it's true that an individual act can be good or evil, that's only true as an expression of a particular person and in light of that person. An act considered abstractly in itself, detached from any person, is neither good nor evil. For more on Scheler's theory of persons, see my video on the human place in the cosmos, specifically the section on spirit or Geist, and the final section where I consider the personal nature of God. But why is any of this relevant to our present discussion? The first reason is this. Scheler has made the moral values of good and evil dependent on the realization of the other values, to which we'll apply the technical definition of non-moral values. But this begs the question of what it means to realize a value, and furthermore, what kind of being a value has before it is realized versus after it is realized. Now, at this point, Scheler can't simply apply that essence-existence distinction, namely that a value in itself is merely an essence while a realized value exists. This is because, as Sprader points out, for Scheler, every entity has both an existence and an essence. And on the eternal in man, he even makes this the third self-evident insight of philosophy. So the difference between a realized and unrealized value isn't whether or not it exists, but the way in which it exists. Sprader argues that Scheler uses the ideal-real distinction to make sense of this. In the formalism, values are given a priori. And on page 48 of that book, Scheler defines the a priori as ideal units of meaning. Elsewhere, he states that every essence is likewise essence of some existent entity, ideal or real, and refers to every existence, ideal or real. So from this it's clear that unrealized values are given as ideal. Though objective, they are nonetheless mental, given in the mind. So how do values get from the mind into reality? Scheler's answer in his Christian period is through the will, which itself is grounded in the mind. Now, humans often struggle to accomplish this. The resistance of already existing reality pushes back against our attempts, and moreover, we can only work with already existing material, shaping, modifying it, or utilizing it in various ways to bring to realization what was previously only ideal. But God does not encounter these constraints. In his creating, there is no pre-existing material and no resistance. His will perfectly realizes the ideal contents of his mind. And this, in fact, is why humans have a pre-existing world that resists them. Behind this universal resistance is the creative will of God. So in this way, God becomes the archetype for the process of realization, for what it means for ideal entities to pass into reality. The realization that humans are capable of, limited as it is derivative of this. But here we have the crux of our first problem, because the mind of God is, by definition, ideal in nature, not real. And the will that realizes ideal entities is grounded in this mind. So how is it that something ideal can transform the ideal into the real? By what force, power, or element of reality can it affect this transition? And related to this, on the level of God, what is the difference between ideal and real? If the divine mind effortlessly realizes itself, can we maintain any meaningful distinction between the real world and the divine mind? Here the two modes of being seem to blend together, if not dissolve into each other completely. Scheler eventually found a solution to this problem in his post-Christian thought, at the price of abandoning the Christian idea of God as an all-powerful spirit creating out of nothing. As we heard Hartmann say in regard to this change, quote, "The gravity of the problem of reality, which preoccupied him more and more year after year, coerced him toward a reorientation," end quote. Scheler solves the problem in his late thought by making spirit, the realm of the ideal, powerless in itself. Thus it is no longer the mental or spiritual will that directly realizes ideal entities such as values. Rather, it is impulsion, drang, the thrust and resistance inherent in all reality. Spirit and impulsion are equally primordial, both founded directly in the ground of being, which is no longer a personal deity. Spirit can have only an indirect influence over what comes to be, by directing and steering the energies of impulsion through the process of sublimation. Thus, a meaningful distinction between ideal and real is maintained here, and the cause of reality remains on the side of the real. And in solving this problem, not only does Scheler arguably gain greater insight into the fundamental nature of being, but he can properly ground his ethics. If moral goodness depends on the realization of higher or positive values, he can now give a coherent account of what this realization means. So that was the first reason Scheler's conception of moral values may have driven his later change in thought. But there's another reason, perhaps more powerful, and this is the so-called problem of evil, because Scheler's understanding of moral value makes the traditional notion of God as a perfectly good being especially susceptible to this problem. To put it simply, in Spader's words, quote, "If God is the creator of this real world, and the moral values of good and evil are co-realized with the realization of non-moral values, how can a good creator God create a world that contains evil?" End quote. The world we live in is clearly a mixture of good and evil, in the sense that sometimes lower values are realized instead of higher, negative values instead of positive. The real world is rife with pain, ignorance, ugliness, injustice, vulgarity, unholiness, as well as containing pleasure, wisdom, beauty, justice, nobility, and holiness. For eons, it barely rose to the level of the agreeable, and now with human life and the capacity to ascend to the heights of the holy, it still all too often lingers in the lowest reaches of the value hierarchy. And on the eternal in man, Scheler rejects the idea that all this evil comes from humans ourselves. It's more fundamental than that. On page 234, he explains, quote, "For the world evil is a necessary constituent in the world we empirically know, and is also necessarily bound to the world's good by a transparent natural law of causality. Indeed, the very ground of all individual evil is this necessary bond between good and evil, even the good and evil of human nature. It is a bond of which we are conscious with an impression of something fatefully tragic, the truth that everyone has the virtues of his faults and the faults of his virtues, that the faults and virtues of every person and every people clearly rise and flow from one source of character in each case. That is what makes the tragic nature of existence," end quote. And he goes on to say, quote, "It is the tragic necessity lying in the bond of good and evil, good and wickedness, in the world we know, which precludes us from seeking the origin of evil only in human wickedness. This tragic bond is itself the greatest evil," end quote. I'm reminded powerfully of Nietzsche, who wrote the following words in Genealogy of Morals, as devastating as they are obvious. Quote, "To speak of just or unjust in itself is quite senseless. In itself, of course, no injury, assault, exploitation, destruction can be unjust, since life operates essentially, that is, in its basic functions, through injury, assault, exploitation, destruction, and simply cannot be thought of at all without this character," end quote. I'll return to the subject of Nietzsche later, but this helps to illustrate the tragic bond we find between good and evil in the world we encounter that goes beyond any human will. Now, for Scheler, when he wrote The Eternal in Man, there nevertheless must be a personal cause for this evil, because reality is necessarily that which is willed. Because reality is necessarily that which is willed. And he finds this cause, predictably enough, in the Christian conception of the devil, as Scheler puts it on page 235, quote, "The origin of wickedness, which is the ultimate basis of this world's evil, and also the cause of direct temptations to human wickedness, can lie neither in the world basis itself, nor solely in man. It must reside in a metaphysical zone lying intermediate between the two, in a free insurrection against God, instigated by a person having power over the world," end quote. At least in that book, and at that stage of his life, Scheler believes he has thereby solved the problem. Though there's a tragic bond between good and evil at the heart of the only world we know, this was put there by that being that rebelled against God and thus corrupted his originally good creation. But Spader points out a fatal flaw in this argument, drawing on Scheler's own words from only the page before. There, Scheler gives an additional reason why the evil of the world cannot originate with human beings. Quote, "That man should fall exclusively from his own free will, without temptation by any higher and mightier element of evil above him, is unthinkable for the God-created image of God, even if we attribute to him a genuine personal freedom, a genuine freedom of choice. Freedom, being intrinsically a positive good, is, ceteris paribus, freedom for good, rather than freedom for evil. The activation of freedom in the sense of a real choice of evil therefore requires a stimulus outside and above man," end quote. The problem is that this applies just as much to the devil as to man, inasmuch as the devil is also a personal God-created image of God. One must then ask, from where did Satan receive the first impulse to sin? And what or whom was his God-created freedom for the good? By what or whom was his God-created freedom for the good corrupted? Positing a devil therefore doesn't solve the problem of evil, but merely shifts it up a level. If there is one personal, all-powerful creator God, he must ultimately be responsible for the evil of the world. But this means that, in the very act of realizing these lower and negative values, he becomes evil, personally partakes of evil, just as he partakes of good. Spader remarks, "No one has laid out the classic problem of evil so simply or so powerfully as Scheler has." And just as in his late thought he sought to solve the problem of the ideal and the real by moving beyond Christian presuppositions, so he attempted to solve the problem of evil, because in his final philosophy the ground of being is not personal, and the impulsion or drang that realizes the world is autonomous from spirit or Geist, and originally perhaps completely autonomous without even the indirect influence of Geist. So there is no almighty, pre-existent personal God who is responsible for the evil of the world, and therefore somewhat evil himself. Moreover, the evil in the world, all the bad stuff that is not the result of human agency, all of this isn't even evil, strictly speaking, for evil presupposes a personal will behind it. But there's no personal will that creates the cosmos we live in, and it came to be through blind, impersonal impulsion or energy. So we could say Scheler avoids the problem of evil in the same way as the atheist. But that's not quite right, because the late Scheler does believe in God, if not the eternal God of traditional theism. Instead, Scheler believes in a God in becoming, who is coming to be in and through human beings, who have the ability to sublimate the energies of impulsion into the service of spirit through the indirect processes of directing and steering. In doing so, they co-realize the divine being who existed as merely potential within the ground of being. This is not the ground of being in itself, which remains, in a sense, impersonal. Though Scheler sometimes refers to this as God in an expanded panentheistic sense, but the God who is coming to be, the spiritual potential that is being realized through human beings, this God, as far as I can tell, is personal. Now, how exactly it is personal and what its relationship is to those humans who realize it is a difficult question. I go into this in the end of my video on the human place in the cosmos, in the final section of that, and admittedly I don't find any single clear answer. Anyway, so we see that Scheler doesn't just absolve God of evil by abolishing his existence, but redeems God by reconsidering his nature. The God that comes to be didn't create the pre-existing evil of the world, and all that he does in and through our own good acts is good. He can consistently realize higher rather than lower values, positive rather than negative. And this almost redeems drang itself, because it's the same forces of impulsion that generated the bad aspects of the world that are absolutely indispensable for the realization of God. In the human place in the cosmos, Scheler specifically distinguishes his position from that of the Buddha, who declared reality itself to be bad. Instead, Scheler holds that reality is indifferent to good or bad. Because although in a sense it opposes spirit, in another sense it is the vehicle for its realization, for the realization of God and all spiritual goodness. So the late Scheler can consistently hold that God is wholly good, the world is not inherently bad, and its negative aspects are not the result of moral evil, aside from those that human persons bring about. That the problem of evil was an important reason for Scheler's change of views is revealed in a late work published posthumously as The Exceptional Metaphysical Place of the Human Being, in a collection titled The Constitution of the Human Being. In this, he explains why he cannot accept the Christian idea that man is a child of God. Before I read the quote, I'll just note that here we'll hear Scheler using the word God in both senses I mentioned above. First as the impersonal panentheistic ground of being, and then, in the final sentence, as the personal God who is coming to be. Here is what he says, quote, I repudiate a God who wants to be my father, and who has taken such bad care of me that I must suffer as I do, and the same goes for the rest of the world. What there is in me of a God with any actual driving force whispers something quite different from any of the above. He says, it's not you, Adam, who is the sinner, who set the world into a tumbling confusion. Not even Lucifer, a fallen angel, is to blame. It is I myself, the fount of all things, and who also inhabits you. I couldn't do otherwise than to bring forth you and the world as you are. I myself am still suffering. I myself am still in a state of becoming. I myself am not perfect. Therefore, I need your help, Adam, from that part of me which is in you, and from that part of you which is in me, to keep up the direction of an eternal divinity, and to accomplish what has become, and to accomplish what has to become, an all-inclusive God under your influence. End quote. As I mentioned, he's speaking of God in two distinct ways here, and the speech he attributes to God, the ground of being, is clearly metaphorical, as it's precisely this ground's impersonal nature that absolves him of the evil of the world. I couldn't do otherwise than to bring forth you and the world as you are. Metaphorically, the very ground of being is still suffering, is still in a state of becoming, and remains imperfect because the all-inclusive personal God, who is latent within it, has not yet been fully manifested through human beings. What Scheler says next shows not only why his late theology satisfied him intellectually, but what it afforded him personally and spiritually. Quote, the budding hatred against the supposed father of fathers, who has treated his children so badly, can henceforth be transformed into love and reverence for the eternal substance. What I have just related is an indication of the way in which I, as a mature person, a man of our times, has again learned to trust and love the fount of everything that is, and to have faith in him, and faith that God has faith in God. End quote. So we've seen how tensions within Scheler's own philosophy at the time of the formalism led logically to Scheler's shift in metaphysical and religious views beginning around 1922, which accords with Scheler's own explicit claim in the 1926 preface to that work that not only do his views on value and ethics remain unchanged, but that they represent the intellectual reasons behind the change in his other views. It therefore seems highly improbable, at least to me, that Scheler's break with Christianity was caused solely by his personal circumstances, however much they did play a role. Personally, I think both kinds of factors played a role. It may be that without the pressure of his romantic dilemma, he would have remained in the church far longer than he did, perhaps even for the remainder of his life, either putting off the resolution of these problems inherent in his work, or finding a different solution he could represent as concordant with church doctrine. He clearly had both a strong emotional connection to and deep intellectual respect for the church. On the other hand, were it not for the intellectual doubts he already nursed, his love and reverence for the church may have swung him to resolve his romantic dilemma differently, on the side of his Catholic wife. But the combination of these two, the temptation and the doubts, decided him to leave the church. Why adhere to something you don't really believe in when the price is the woman you love? We come now to the second major question of this video. In his late thought, does Scheler achieve a genuinely post-Christian philosophy? By this I don't simply mean a philosophy that comes after Christianity in the time of history or an individual life, but one that truly goes beyond it, goes further than it, transcends it, after understanding and assimilating what is essentially wise within it. Obviously, for many people in the Western world, the Christian worldview lies in the past. but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has been transcended. As I think we're seeing lately, people who were thoroughly post-Christian in this limited sense are rediscovering the immense wisdom and value of this worldview as though for the first time, are rediscovering in it elements of being that were sorely lacking from the modern worldviews that replaced it. I was one of them, and I think it's fair to say so was Scheler at the beginning of the 20th century. So the question regarding Scheler comes to something like this. Does his break with Christianity represent a moving on or a falling away? Based on what we've just seen, it could be suggested that Scheler embraces a Christian worldview because of the ethical personalism inherent in it, but finds eventually that he must push beyond it because of the contradictions it contains for the sake of that same ethical personalism. But this is complicated by his personal circumstances, which are more suggestive of a falling away from something he revered as truth, yet lacked the personal strength or will to adhere to. So to try and answer this question, I'm going to explore some of the characteristics of his late philosophy and compare them with Christianity, as well as with other religions and philosophies. If it recognizes Christian insights and is convergent with other major attempts to understand being, I think we can at least make a good case that it represents one genuine way beyond Christianity, if we grant that any such territory even exists. Now, one of the most notable features of Scheler's late philosophy is its apparent dualism. It's built around the two opposing principles of Geist and Drang, and this has been seen as one of its greatest weaknesses. There's something inherently implausible about the idea of being as split between two contradictory principles. Surely being is something unitary, coherent, one. And furthermore, certain inconsistencies seem to arise from the particular dualism of Drang and Geist that Scheler employs. For one, if Geist is truly powerless, how does it exert any influence on Drang? And secondly, if Drang is completely blind to the ideal realm of Geist, how can it receive any influence from it, even at the level of the human being? I've gone into these questions in much more detail in my video on the human place in the cosmos, but I'll recapitulate my answers briefly here. But please see that video for the full arguments, and I should also note that I'm deeply indebted to Spader's book for much of these. To the first objection, though, that in the first place Scheler's philosophy is a dualism, my answer would be fairly straightforward. It's not a dualism. While it has a dualistic aspect in that it's based around two principles, these principles are both rooted in the one unitary ground of being. Being is ultimately one. Moreover, they're not totally opposed. In a way, they're deeply complementary. Each provides the other what it lacks, and they come together to realize God in the human being. Finally, there's not necessarily even just two of them. Scheler makes it clear that these are the only two attributes of the ground of being known to us. Scheler makes it clear that these are only the two attributes of the ground of being that are known to us, implying that there might be some others. The next objection concerns the powerlessness of Geist. If it is truly powerless, how can it have any effect at all? The answer is that it's not utterly powerless in every sense of that term. Scheler's rhetoric can be misleading because he sees himself as pushing back against a fundamental error ingrained in Western philosophy. But upon sober consideration, it's clear that spirit has a kind of power. Steering and directing are indeed forms of power. Still, it cannot directly control Drang. The type of power it lacks is creative power. And the final objection, if Drang is pure force, blind to ideals, how can it ever come to be guided by them? The answer is that spirit already has an influence upon all levels and stages of being. Though Scheler often talks as though spirit makes its first appearance with human being, this too is an excess of rhetoric to guard against the dangers of a Freudian or Schopenhauerian attempt to reduce spirit to the self-negation of a more primitive force. But a closer examination of Scheler's system suggests that spirit is active from the lowest level of being up. each level gaining more and more of the determination, order, and awareness that is characteristic of spirit. So while the decisive step may indeed be at the level of the human being, the drang in us, our drives and instincts inherited from animals, can already spiritually see enough to be guided by the ideas and images that human Geist holds out to it. Then there's a question of whether this is an optimistic or a pessimistic view of being. It's often been portrayed as pessimistic, but I don't think this is accurate. In his introduction to On the Eternal in Man, Graham McAleer refers to Scheler's late thought as a tragic ontology, and in his introduction to the 1954 English translation of Scheler's The Nature of Sympathy, Werner Stark goes to the extreme of saying that in his last years, quote, he sank deeper and deeper into materialism, skepticism, and atheism, and it is perhaps not altogether fanciful to suggest his untimely, all too early death was not entirely unconnected with the growing despair that had taken hold of his mind. End quote. Now the reference to materialism, skepticism, and atheism is puzzling, as none of these characterize his thought as captured in The Human Place in the Cosmos, published the year that he died. But is his late thought pessimistic? Well, for one, it knows no omnipotent, fully realized personal God who we can pray to. And to the extent that there is a personal God, he depends on us. And there's no guarantee the process of God's coming to be will be completed. This view also knows no personal immortality, no afterlife. And the very tension between Geist and Drang could be seen as tragic, putting tension at the heart of being, binding spiritual ideas to the whims of impulsion, and equating life with suffering through Scheler's idea that reality is resistance and that this resistance is experienced as angst. Well, in regard to God, it seems that Scheler at least is prepared to trade a sense of childlike dependence on him for a riskier sense of nobility as God's collaborator. We saw that in the passage already quoted where Scheler repudiates God as a father, but embraces him as a companion and thereby finds love and trust and faith in him again. It appears that even in his lifetime, Scheler was told his theology was pessimistic. At the end of The Human Place in the Cosmos, he writes, quote, one might tell me at this point, and indeed I was once told, that it is impossible to bear the idea of an unfinished in God and becoming. My answer is that metaphysics is not an insurance company for weak people in need of protection. Metaphysics requires and presupposes human beings with strong and courageous minds. End quote. The page before, he talks about various kinds of relation man may have with God, and praises the Christian conception of humans as children of God, as, quote, the highest possible form of monotheism, end quote. So while he denigrates this viewpoint, he does so with the understanding that it is the best possible given a certain conception of God. And it could be argued that the next logical step beyond this conception that brings humans so close to the nature of God would be very much like Scheler's notion of humans as co-realizers of and collaborators with a becoming God. Regarding the tension between Drang and Geist, we've already explained how this may be overstated by Scheler's detractors and to some extent by Scheler himself. While there is indeed a tension near the heart of being, though not of course at its deepest level, the ens are se, or ground of being, which is one, though there's a tension, it's for the sake of progression to a resolution, to the uniting and interpenetration of Drang and Geist in the realized God, which for Scheler is simply inconceivable otherwise. On page 62 of Human Place in the Cosmos, in distancing himself from the views of a more pessimistic thinker, he explicitly states, quote, spirit and life are dovetailed. It is a fundamental mistake to think that they have since their beginnings been against each other in hostility and struggle, end quote. Inasmuch as Scheler sees a cosmic trajectory toward the incarnation of spirit and hopes for its fulfillment, his vision is certainly optimistic. The rub is that this isn't guaranteed but depends on us. But then, is that a better or a worse aspect of a worldview? That we're not just cogs in a clockwork universe winding toward perfection could be seen as a victory for human dignity. And certainly there's a similarity with Christianity in that our own salvation, our own eternal destiny, is dependent on how we actually live. Now, whether this refers to our faith or our works, I think this makes little difference. The difference with Scheler's view is that the fate of God and the cosmos hangs on our shoulders. We could say that Scheler's philosophy is pessimistic because it enslaves spirit to the whims of impulsion. But this would be first to ignore the power spirit does have, even if it's not creative power, as well as to ignore what we saw just now. Spirit and life are dovetailed. That Geist and Drang each have their own original nature is the very thing that affords their interpenetration and makes that interpenetration both meaningful and valuable. It could be fruitful, perhaps, to contemplate this along the lines of the divine and human natures of Christ. That real existence is in fact resistance and therefore angst, and therefore life is suffering. This certainly could be seen as a despairing view. In his final book, Scheler appears to have a great respect for Buddha, who had a similar view and therefore, says Scheler, sought to escape existence entirely. But crucially, Scheler explicitly differentiates his own view from Buddha's. For himself, while living is suffering, it's not therefore bad. And to the extent we escape from the press of reality through flights of ideation, we should nevertheless return to it, to make improvements on it, on the basis of these insights, to, quote, seek true life and the true destiny of the human being in adjusting the everlasting tension of the eternal rhythm between idea reality and spirit impulsion, end quote. While life is suffering, the suffering is worth it to realize ideals, to realize values, and thereby bring God into being. Christianity also has a place for suffering. The passion of Christ that God himself embraces and endures for the salvation of the world, that humans may unite their own suffering to in order to redeem it. Finally, the issue of personal immortality in the afterlife. Scheler's late thought has no place for it, except possibly as it pertains to God, a difficult question we won't go into here. But for human beings, there's no life beyond the one we are actually living. Compared to Christianity's promise of eternal bliss, this seems a hopelessly pessimistic vision. But there are a few things we ought to consider here. First, that Christian hope has a horrific price. The idea of an eternal hell, of unending suffering for the damned. Here we find Christianity's own tragic dualism. Second, it seems to me that both the coherence and the appeal of eternal life collapse if we consider it in any great depth. Would I want to live literally forever? And would it be me who so lives in any meaningful way? I've written an article on this, which I'll also link in the description, so I won't go into it here. And furthermore, is a finite existence really so terrible? Isn't that precisely what it is to be a specific person? Doesn't it make everything we have all the more precious and sweet? And as for immortality, isn't it the case that we can still participate in this in all the ways that it is good and possible to do so? In the very ground of our being, which is the same as that of the universe, and at the other end of the scale, in the effects of our life and all that we carry forward. There's also a timelessness to our personal being, not to be confused with personal immortality. For Scheler, writing in the Formalism, acts spring from the person into time. In 1927, in a note Scheler intended for the conclusion of his never-completed philosophical anthropology, he expresses his thoughts about death. These are quoted in Chapter 9 of Manfred Fring's book, The Mind of Max Scheler. As with his remarks on God the Father, this is illuminating, both in regard to his intellectual ideas and to his personal feelings at the time. He writes, quote, "He who loves dies comfortably. He who took into himself enough of the life-giving nectar of the world, and who was both responsible and co-responsible for his fellow human beings, he too will die comfortably. And he who had been sensitive to the essential powers of ego-alien nature during his lifetime, and who felt borne by its colossal wave that he could control to a small extent, he too will succumb peacefully to all tides of nature." End quote. And then, a little further on, quote, "The cosmic, theogonic, solidary order of the becoming of world and deity will crush all angst of death. It will provide redemption from an objectified ego. It will make us feel that we continue to live in every flower, insect, in all winds and clouds. This order will make us feel also that our thinking too goes on in every other later mind that links up its ongoing thoughts with ours." End quote. Now, just because a philosophy is pessimistic doesn't mean it's untrue. Still, I think a philosophical worldview should be expected to orient us helpfully in the world without sacrificing truth. I think there is an element of tragedy in Scheler's late philosophy, in the ultimate fragility of things and in the fundamental tensions that dwell within them. But there is tragedy in Christianity too. For instance, in the horrific doctrine of eternal hell, half concealed by the notion that its denizens deserve it. But from the lines I've just read from Scheler in 1927, it should be clear that, in spite of that tragedy, there is joy and hope. And it should also be clear that, very much contrary to Stark's suggestion, he didn't die in or of despair. But these late thoughts of Scheler on the topic of death and immortality lead me to another consideration, because I've already suggested Scheler was attracted to Christianity in the first place because of its personalism, its emphasis on the value, moral dignity, and ontological irreducibility of every human person. This is something that arguably Scheler received from Christianity and then delivered back to it, invigorated and renewed. I say this due to the profound impact his ethical personalism has had on subsequent Catholic philosophy. And it would seem that the highest expression of a personalist philosophy would be a personal God. So Scheler's turn to a kind of panentheism could be seen as a betrayal of that philosophy and a falling away from its genuine insights. How to make sense of this? The first thing I want to note is that even within Christianity, things are not so clear-cut as they seem. Is the Christian God personal? Well, yes, but in a peculiar sense. He is tri-personal, three persons. Already we have a situation radically different from that of the human being. Even if we can find certain analogies of the Trinity in the human being, the fact that these are only analogies is precisely to the point. It's the fundamental, irreducible nature of the person that is in question here. If I am fundamentally personal, my person grounds and unites all other aspects of my being. But if I am three persons, my fundamental nature is whatever grounds and unites these three persons. Even within Christian theology, it seems to me that the godness of God, so to speak, transcends personality. Add to this the difficult ontological situation of Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, God himself and yet in every way, except for sin, a human being. Though really acknowledged as such, this is already a panentheism. Somehow, God can dwell within creation as a human being. I can't help thinking that, from a philosophical perspective at least, limiting this to the one man Jesus is futile. If God can be incarnate in him, he can be incarnate in anyone. In fact, if God can be incarnate in him, he is already, at least implicitly, incarnate in everything in the entire universe, because the matter that made up the man, Jesus Christ, came from and returned to the universe. And he was a dynamic system, united and utterly entwined with it, as everyone is. So I would say that Christianity is already implicitly a panentheism, both in the sense that God as the ground of being is ultimately beyond personality, and in the sense that God manifests in and through human beings. It could be argued that Scheler takes these implicit aspects and expands on them after having expanded on the more prominent personalistic aspects of the religion, although of course he's also drawing from other sources, most notably Spinoza and German idealism. Still, the question may be posed whether, in developing this panentheistic side of his philosophy, the personalistic side is mutilated or destroyed. I don't think this is the case. As we've seen, he never disowned the ethical personalism of his earlier work, and in fact, he claimed that it was the reason why his metaphysical views changed, and we've seen a couple of examples of exactly how that might have happened. In his final book, he remains a resolute personalist. On page 34, echoing his earlier work, he declares, quote, "Spirit's center, the person, is not objectifiable, nor is the person a thing-like being. The person is a constantly self-executing ordered structure of acts, and essentially a specific structure. The person is only in his acts and exists only through them," end quote. Now, I talk a little more about what this means in my last video, so please check that out if you're interested. But basically what Scheler is emphasizing here is that the person is the specific unity of his intentional acts. Everyone has a specific way of acting that binds all their acts together in a meaningful whole, making them concrete rather than abstract and interchangeable with others. But there's no personal substance standing behind a person's acts that would remain without the acts themselves. There is thus nothing that could be made into a static, determinate object. Nonetheless, the person as the unity of his acts is really there in them. Our acts have a genuine concreteness and coherence, which we can intuit by a kind of non-objectifying participation in others. Thus, each human being is a person. Each human being has their own concrete yet transcendent spiritual center. I think that Scheler's view of the person is just the right balance of transcendence with concreteness or immanence. Too much transcendence would tear us away from the particularity which is constitutive of a person. We'd be left with something like pure potential being or pure consciousness without specific content. But on the other hand, too much immanence, and the person becomes an inert object, one particular thing among others. So I think Scheler's definition of the person is excellent, but is it undermined by his panentheism? I don't think so. It only means that the person isn't ontological bedrock. But that it isn't ontological bedrock doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or doesn't have that specific mode of existence that is described here. On the deepest level, I am an expression of the one impersonal ground of being. But that expression is a specifically personal expression, and specifically this specific person. The person is still irreducible in all the ways that matter. Just as a value for Scheler is irreducible to an abstract rule or concrete human interests, but is nonetheless reducible, so to speak, to spirit in the sense of being part of its order and grounded in it. At this point, my attention is drawn to Hinduism, of which some major strains hold to an impersonal panentheism or monism, while others hold to a rigid dualism between a personal God and man, and there are many shades in between. The various schools have long had to contend with, account for, and often integrate each other's views. One figure who fascinates me is the late 19th century Bengali saint Sri Ramakrishna, who adhered philosophically to the monistic view while fervently practicing dualistic bhakti, or devotion to a personal god. I've made a video in which I discuss him in more depth, which I'll also link to in the description. Through practicing various different strains of Hinduism, he arrived at what we could describe as a synthesis of their wisdom. While he did hold that ultimately all being is one, he didn't denigrate the world of multiplicity as pure, worthless illusion, as some of the more rigorous adherents of the monistic view have done. The deepest wisdom is not to realize that all the manifest world is unreal and God alone is real, but that the world is real because God has become the world. Here's a quote from chapter 3 of the book of Sayings, recorded by a disciple, known in English as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Just a note on the terminology. Brahman is the one impersonal or transpersonal God or ground of being, and a jnani is someone who uses reasoning to reach enlightenment. The other terms are explained within the quote itself. Quote, the jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating, not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind, one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized intuitively as Brahman, through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, without attributes, is also saguna, with attributes. End quote. Impersonal being has real value. Ramakrishna, who is often given to ecstatic states of oneness with Brahman, is said to have prayed to be kept on a plane of consciousness low enough that he could taste the sweetness of love for God and commune with his disciples. The following quote from chapter 6 of the Gospel describes how the impersonal Brahman takes on personal forms for the sake of his devotees. Quote, think of Brahman as a shoreless ocean. Through the cooling influence, as it were, of the bhakta's love, the water has frozen at places into blocks of ice. In other words, God now and then assumes various forms for his lovers and reveals himself to them as a person. But with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the blocks of ice melt. Then one doesn't feel any more that God is a person, nor does one see God's forms. What he is cannot be described. Who will describe him? He who would do so disappears. He cannot find his eye any more. End quote. That last point is also crucial, I think. The encounter or identification with the bedrock of our being, which is the bedrock of all being, is experienced as a dissolution of the person, without being for that reason a mere void. While these are states of being far beyond my experience, nevertheless it does seem to me that this is not the exchanging of one's individual self for a cosmic self, a notion G.K. Chesterton parodied as one enormously selfish person. It doesn't seem that one suddenly wakes up as God, nor does it seem one literally ceases to exist, because that fundamental level of being simply is not the level of persons or selves. Though it grounds them, illuminates them, and manifests as them, the levels are not in competition. The ground of being will continue to manifest as me and all persons, and, on the level of persons, each will be precisely and irreducibly themselves, though perhaps sometimes a mystic will taste of the bewildering blissful unity that underlies them. For me, Ramakrishna points the way from the side of an age-old panentheistic tradition towards a panentheism that recognizes and values persons, just as Scheler does, coming from the side of personalism. But there's another astonishing resonance I've noticed between Scheler's philosophy and Hindu thought, and this concerns his particular dualism of spirit and impulsion. Although this conception is rare in Western philosophy, one finds it thousands of years ago in the Sankhya philosophy, which posited a fundamental dualism between Purusha, which could be described as pure spirit or consciousness, and Prakriti, nature or matter. Purusha is utterly independent of Prakriti and utterly powerless. All energy and activity resides in Prakriti, and it is even Prakriti, not Purusha, that affects the latter's liberation from deluded entanglement in it. Later, Sankhya ideas were taken up and reinterpreted by monistic schools, such that you get a system even more similar to Scheler's, these dual principles both founded in the same fundamental ground of being. In certain strains of Shaivism, Shaktism, and Tantra, you have the idea that this ultimate being manifests in the dual aspects of Shiva and Shakti, the god, who is absolute consciousness or spirit, and the goddess, his wife, who is absolute energy. Like Purusha and Scheler's Geist, Shiva is powerless without Shakti. But, it might also be said, Shakti without Shiva becomes blind, destructive chaos. The images you see on the screen are a very common depiction of the two. In both of these we see Shakti in her form of the goddess Kali, with Shiva lying beneath her feet. The story goes that in battling an army of demons, Kali became intoxicated by their blood and lost control of herself, threatening the entire world with destruction. None of the other deities could restrain her, so her husband, the supreme god Shiva, went and lay before her and allowed her to trample him. When her feet touched his body, she came back to herself and ceased her carnage. I talk about this image in more depth in a video I made called Christ and Kali, Convergent Symbolism, which I'll also link to. Now I realize I'm linking to a lot of previous videos, but all I can say in my defense is that I can't help it. I think it's because so many guiding threads of this channel are coming together in this video. Anyway, be that as it may, about that video I'll just say one more thing. The image you see here is an icon of the crucifixion. Now, there's a traditional saying that relates to this picture. Shiva without Shakti is Shava, a corpse. To me, this is just a stunning parallel to Scheler's late philosophy. Spirit without impulsion is inert, lifeless, unreal. Both are aspects of the same fundamental being, and it's in their union and interpenetration that the universe and human beings come to be and flourish. While it's possible Scheler was aware of Sankhya and the tendencies of Hinduism that hold Shiva and Shakti as equal, I haven't found specific evidence of this. It's likely he was influenced by Hindu philosophy through other thinkers. The influence through Schopenhauer alone would be significant, although Schopenhauer's interpretation is perhaps uniquely pessimistic and lacks the affirmation of manifest existence we find in reverence for Shakti. And of course, Scheler's ideas aren't identical to the Hindu. For a start, spirit in Scheler isn't exactly the same as Purusha or Shiva, which tend to be portrayed as pure, formless consciousness, whereas Scheler's spirit is more rife with form, even if only potential or ideal. And the idea of a possible progressive development through time is traditionally absent in Hinduism, at least in the same way. Time is generally conceived as an endless cycle of universes within which humanity begins in utmost righteousness and then steadily declines. But I think the consonance of Scheler's ideas with Hindu philosophy is significant. Firstly, because it shows they're not merely a personal idiosyncrasy, but something that many other philosophers and sages have come to from an entirely different civilization. Further, that in that civilization they were derived from and intertwined with intensive spiritual practice also leads them credence. Religion and philosophy in India have been all but inseparable. This can be a detriment, certainly, when mere dogma gets in the way, but I think the highly practical and experiential nature of Indian religion tends to guard against this. Generally speaking, in Indian philosophy, speculation on the ground and basic principles of being is heavily conditioned by experience. Now, before moving on, I'll just acknowledge something I don't understand about Scheler's panentheistic personalism, and that's the relation that the personal God who is coming to be has to human persons. It's not clear to me whether we and this God are all fully fledged persons, albeit in a state of becoming, cooperating with each other, or whether this God is only a person inasmuch as he participates in us, or whether we are only persons inasmuch as we participate in him. If the first option is correct, we're left with the problem of exactly where and how this distinct divine person exists. As in the late Scheler, spirit by itself isn't real. If the second option is correct, and God is only personal as each human being, we have the problem of how to square this with a lot of the language Scheler uses about cooperating and co-creating with God. And if the third option is correct, and this God is the only true person, it's hard to see how he, as person, that is to say, an ordered structure or unity of acts, it's hard to see how he could underlie and unify the incredibly various unities that each of us seem to be. I go into these problems in greater depth in my video on the human place in the cosmos, so check out that if you're interested. But to bring this section to a close, I'd say, at least in regard to human persons, that Scheler's panentheism doesn't necessarily conflict with his personalism. A non-personal, panentheistic ground of being doesn't have to negate the distinctive reality and value of persons who are expressions of this ground. Another aspect of Scheler's philosophy that fascinates me is that it seems to unite, or at least bring into intimate dialogue, two otherwise fundamentally opposed tendencies of thought. In his middle period, he was known as the Catholic Nietzsche, a moniker given to him by the philosopher and theologian Ernst Troeltsch, and it's clear that he was heavily influenced by Nietzsche and had something of his spirit. His book on Ressentiment is a development of Nietzsche's idea of resentment, whereby the perception of values is warped by the powerless, such that what is low appears high and what is high appears low. Nietzsche believed that Christianity was the epitome of this twisted process, but Scheler takes up the concept and shows how genuine Christianity is the opposite of this. For instance, he argues that it wasn't from resentment, but from a heedless generosity springing from a blissful sense of inner abundance that the early Christians gave up their possessions and their lives. In other words, he argues for Christianity from a Nietzschean perspective. And it should be noted that this time in agreement with Nietzsche, it should be noted that he locates true ressentiment in the egalitarian bourgeois morality of the Enlightenment. But all this begs the question, what did the Catholic Nietzsche become after he abandoned Catholicism? Well, he didn't simply become a Nietzschean or Nietzsche, but something more interesting. I would argue he became a Nietzschean Platonist or a Platonic Nietzsche. This is precisely what is embodied in his duality of Geist and Drang. Geist containing an intrinsic order of essences much like Plato's forms, and Drang being incredibly similar to Nietzsche's will to power. Thus Scheler attempts to do justice to both thinkers and both tendencies of thought, or we could say to both aspects of being, because it does strike me as true that being consists of or contains both these aspects. There is an energetic, dynamic, embodied aspect, and a timeless, abstract, essential aspect, and it doesn't seem to me that we can construct the world solely from the one or from the other. Plato's great virtue is that he draws our attention to the essences that inhere in the world and make it intelligible. Plato's flaw is that he attributes the highest reality to these essences or forms, which generates all sorts of confusing paradoxes, as well as suggesting that they have the greatest power. But it seems far more correct to say that, although they do exist in their own unique way, essences in themselves have no reality. Nietzsche's great virtue lies in drawing our attention to the actual world, full of dynamism and flux, and to our own actual drives and motivations. Nietzsche focuses on manifest reality, but tries to explain the ideal or essential purely in terms of this. And I would say this fails, though it succeeds just enough, contains just enough truth to appear convincing. Take the problem of values. Nietzsche famously held these to be human constructions and capable of reconstruction in a different way. And we could cite myriads of impulses and interests extraneous to a value that played a role in its history or often comes to bear when a person claims to be following it. But none of this explains the value or explains away the value. It remains irreducibly itself, stubbornly intelligible only as itself, unaffected by all of this. This is why Scheler insists that values are objective. And we have the added problem of understanding the impulses and interests that a specific value is to be interpreted in light of. Even if we reduce everything to the will to power, we still must have an intuition of what power is, and that it is valuable. We see in this exercise how being simply falls apart if we attempt to step outside the self-evident essences that make our world intelligible. They continually reassert themselves in the attempt to understand anything. Call the world nothing but a becoming of the will to power. Right there you have essences, implying other essences, implying perhaps the entire structure of essences. So Scheler embraces the virtues of both Plato and Nietzsche while rejecting their flaws, and I think this is really impressive, though it's unfortunate he didn't live to explain his metaphysics in a more systematic and detailed way. But on an emotional level too, it appeals to me because of its holistic aspiration for the world and human beings. Christianity envisions a complete redemption and purification of the world, at least for the saved, from sin and suffering. That is to say, from all the dark energies that, as Nietzsche never ceased to point out with such brilliance, give it its reality. Platonism for the people, as Nietzsche suggested, it aspires to a mode of being that is actually devoid of all the qualities of reality. But Scheler takes a different course. In a late essay titled Man in the Age of Adjustment, included in a posthumous collection called Philosophical Perspectives, and I'll include a link to this. I believe this is also available online. So I'll also include a link in the description. In this essay, he proposes instead, quote, a conception of self, world, and God which comprises light and darkness, the spirit and the fate-determining demonic drive for existence and life. This conception roots man, both as a creature of spirit and of drive, in the divine source of all things. It accepts the general and total dependence of life, or nature, on spirit, along with the dependence of spirit on life and nature, and it integrates this interdependence into the idea of the source of the world which, as substance, stands above both poles of this contrast, and in which the reconciliation of spirit and life, of idea and power, takes place, although only in the course of world history and not independently of human action, end quote. That's a quote from page 122. To emphasize its holistic nature, Scheler calls his ideal man of the future the Allmensch, the total man. We see a similar regard for the holistic development of the human being in Carl Jung, someone else who was deeply influenced by Nietzsche, yet also affirmed spirit and objective essences, though in a somewhat different way than Scheler. So here especially we see how Scheler's philosophy may be a genuinely post-Christian philosophy. It integrates what we might call the Platonic presuppositions of Christianity with the Dionysian insights of Nietzsche, and thereby moves beyond Christianity. But at the same time, one has to wonder about Scheler's final vision, the Allmensch and the full realization of God in history. Assuming such a culmination of the process were possible, of necessity this would not be utopia, and such a complete man would not be a perfect man, to employ a distinction Jung was fond of. By the nature of the two attributes of ultimate being, it seems there simply cannot be a stable, finalized, unproblematic world. To imagine this immediately sweeps us back to Platonic dreaming. Likewise, there can never be a full embrace of the Dionysian flux and flow. Spirit in us, in its essences and values, forever protests against this. So for all the magnificence the interpenetration of these two principles may attain, it appears there will always be an irreducible chaos and tension. And so it would seem the final vision is indeed tragic, though by no means therefore pessimistic, but tragic in the rich sense often meant by Nietzsche, a tragedy which is beautiful, noble, and full of being. Scheler proposes a philosophy, not a religion, and the way he chose to live his life in the end was as a philosopher, not a religious believer. So the question of how these two things relate to each other inevitably arises when considering his shift in thinking. But for me, this question has a personal significance as well, as someone who feels the attractions of each, who feels their conflict, and who dearly wants to know how to orient his life. In his middle period, Scheler sees them as complementary, though religion is certainly primary as it leads to salvation. In On the Eternal in Man, he talks about how man can apprehend the absolute in different ways through both metaphysics and religion. But religion isn't a kind of simplified or allegorized metaphysics. Rather, religious acts are sui generis, their own type of intentional act, that apprehend aspects of reality in an utterly original way, aspects closed to other kinds of acts, including the cognition involved in metaphysics. Metaphysics can only uncover a limited amount of knowledge about God as absolute or self-subsistent being. Only religion can bring us into relation with this personal being. But this, of course, changes by the end of his life. In The Human Place in the Cosmos, he dismisses religion as the understandable but ultimately misguided attempt to secure comfort and protection by filling out the realm of the absolute with familiar figures whom we can deal with. On page 64, he contrasts this with a fundamentally different response. Instead, man could, quote, pause in wonder and start directing his spirit to grasp the absolute and become a part of it, end quote. This is, in effect, a kind of engaged spiritual metaphysics. He elaborates on this approach further on the final page, advocating, quote, a basic act of personal readiness to act for the deity, as well as our self-identification with its directions of spiritual acts in any sense of this term. The ultimate being of what is through itself is not an object, exactly in the same sense as a person is not an object. One can partake of ultimate being's life and spiritual activity only by co-execution, by the act of our readiness to act, and by active identification, end quote. So in what is a marked change from his middle period for the late Scheler metaphysics or philosophy, at least of this sort, is definitely superior to religion. It brings us into a fuller contact with the absolute, though of course it can't be divorced from will and action. Now, beyond these broad characterizations of the two paths, Scheler doesn't explain exactly why his arguments in favor of religion in the eternal in man no longer hold. In fact, I suspect they do still partially hold. I want to bring in a quote by his widow Maria Scheler, who spent the rest of her life collecting and editing his works. It occurs in her editorial note for the 4th edition of that book and refers to the book's central and longest essay, Problems of Religion. She writes, quote, "The paths of Christian theism in its Catholic form, with which Scheler first increasingly, then decreasingly identified himself in his writings from roughly 1912 to 1922, were regarded by Max Scheler himself as part of a genuine development in his thought and as a necessary transition to the metaphysical views of his later years, views which he continued to profess even in the face of death, with the calm assurance of one who has found his road. On the other hand, he insisted that in the context of a personalistic, spiritualistic conception of God, the phenomenology of religion set forth in Problems of Religion retained its validity and internal logic." End quote. I find this both illuminating and intriguing. First of all, it suggests that Scheler himself felt that he had moved beyond Christianity as a necessary stage on the road. But it also suggests that, to the end, he believed theistic religion has its own validity, if ultimately a relative one. This makes me think of the intriguing quote by Sri Ramakrishna, "God now and then assumes various forms for his lovers and reveals himself to them as a person." He's not saying that the personal forms of God are sheer errors, mistakes, illusions. There is something objective to them, but they are not the ultimate reality. The figures projected by human beings onto the absolute realm, in Scheler's later account of religion, may not be merely human projections, but conditioned also by the nature of that realm, which the light of the absolute shines through. And this does appear to be the case. Religious imagery, however wild or anthropomorphic, does seem to genuinely connect us to and draw us into the absolute and holy. And this would be one major benefit of religion. It engages our imagination as well as our will and desires in a way that philosophy tends not to. Crucially, it provides human models to emulate, which Scheler believed was essential to moral development, although there are arguably philosophical analogues here as well. Consider the role that Socrates the person has played. It also provides a coherent community with a sense of tradition stretching from the distant past into the future. And it gives us focus, how to think of fundamental things, what to contemplate, exactly what to do, and how to cultivate virtue. We don't have to go and try and solve fundamental ontological or epistemological questions, but can grow in wisdom nonetheless. These are all attractive qualities of religion. So what are the downsides? Well, I would say, for all its benefits, it forces us into a particular kind of basic dishonesty. To illustrate this, I want to turn back to Scheler's Christian period, to the eternal in man. In Problems of Religion, the book's central essay, he shows in effect how a phenomenology of religious acts and experiences themselves leads to a Christian worldview, and specifically a Catholic one. Of course, he doesn't announce that he will do this. He proposes he's just describing things as they are, these basic acts and experiences as they are actually given, while bracketing any ideological assumptions. Nevertheless, for a reader not already fully identified with the Catholic religion, it's remarkable how his observations and arguments snake their way, for all the genuine insight they do contain, toward Catholic conclusions. For example, Scheler employs the concept of natural religion and develops what this consists of. Traditionally, this is what can This is what can be known of God by reason alone, as opposed to what is specifically revealed by him. But for Scheler, religion is categorically different from metaphysics. All religion is revelation. So on page 161, he explains that natural religion is founded on how, quote, the divine presents and manifests itself in all things, events and orders which belong to the natural reality accessible in principle to all, to the reality of the mind, to the social reality of history, end quote. In contrast to this, positive revelation is when the divine, quote, presents or announces itself through the medium of the word and through persons, homines religiosi in the most eminent sense, end quote. But just as in the older distinction between natural religion, as established by reason, and revealed religion by revelation, natural religion served as a non-threatening foundation for the more specific doctrines of revealed religion, so we see a similar pattern in this work of Scheler's. In short, natural religion recognizes an infinite, omnipotent, and holy God that is an intelligent, free, good, and loving mind, and the creator of the universe. While this would suggest God as a person, nevertheless the unique personality of God is withheld from natural revelation. This would be something like the difference between knowing that someone is a person and knowing that person. Even the specifically Christian doctrine of the fall, in outline, if not in precise detail, is something that can be known to natural theology. But here we see what Scheler's really doing. Projecting back from the already established beliefs of a particular religion, at that time his particular religion, because this conception of natural religion is essentially Christianity without some final touches. It's arguable whether any actual religion embodies it. If we consider the doctrine of the fall, even Judaism and Islam fall short. But more importantly, it doesn't do justice either to the sheer diversity of religious experience within humanity, nor the genuinely primitive forms it can take, which tend to be strongly animistic, and which is where we would expect to see, if anywhere, a manifestation of religion solely based upon natural revelation. At the end of the Problems of Religion essay, in a section titled Why No New Religion, Scheler argues that if we grant God is personal and loving and revealed himself in a man of utmost holiness, then we must grant the absolute magisterial authority of the Church. From page 342, quote, this is the essential necessity of an objective, all-embracing institute of salvation with supreme infallible authority for the preserving of the blessings of salvation and their transmission to men, end quote. And this leads into his discussion of the traditional idea of the sacrifice of the intellect, which he describes as, quote, the highest and strictly most complete and noble sacrifice that is open to man, end quote. It is the free self-subordination of man's reason to the Church concerning all questions relevant to salvation. It is this the Church, founded by God, justly demands of us. Scheler defends and glorifies this sacrifice. It is, after all, the free sacrifice of a genuine good, a good higher even than honor or life, motivated by a genuine love of God and one's own incompetence, conditioned by original sin to reliably understand ultimate things. And I like that Scheler points out these positive aspects of the sacrificium intellectus, and I can see how it may be incredibly helpful in the spiritual quest. And even as I was rereading these lines, I felt a surge of yearning for what Scheler calls the acts in the mind which underlie the entity called authority, namely, quote, love and trust which is manifestly placed in authority's higher and deeper insight by virtue of its perceptible and sensible inner dignity. This dignity it does not possess through the individual personal qualities of its wielders, but because it was originally founded, with therefore all its offices, by the holy man of God, end quote. Nevertheless, at the end of the work, we're brought to a kind of paradox, because now we must ask, to what extent was what we just read through the course of the essay authentic insight and honest argument, and to what extent was it conditioned by Scheler's own sacrifice of the intellect to the authority of the Church? Now, once again, I want to acknowledge the benefits of the sacrificium intellectus, apart from the ascetic, self-mortifying function it has, and it seems such things are spiritually helpful, but apart from this, it focuses one's intellect, forces one to meditate over and over again on the same dogmas, the same particular formulations or truths, without stepping beyond their bounds. One thus discovers an incredible richness within them, latent meanings, links to many different areas of experience and being that illuminates and makes sense of them. But this leads to paradoxes of its own, because what's really going on here? I don't deny there's wisdom already in the dogmas, or even that there's a certain undisclosed depths of this, but at a certain point the line becomes blurred between what's really there and what we put there. And the wide-ranging insights that are generated, these are at least as likely to be the result of concentrated thought itself, the repetitive asking, how can this be true, which must be true, which forces the mind to engage deeply with reality and experience and apprehend similarities with the basic forms these dogmas often take. If we again consider the Trinity, for example, there are countless examples of this, but then there are countless examples of the form 3 in 1. But there are also countless examples of the forms 2 in 1 and 4 in 1. Jung, for instance, strongly preferred the latter and also found it everywhere and discovered great insights through it. So dogma is generative in its limitation. But that doesn't mean it's simply true, nor does this function of the phenomenon itself privilege certain systems of religious dogma over others. It also reveals the tension within dogma. Its generativity is, in large part, the human intellect frantically working to overcome and escape it, even as it represents itself as rigidly adhering to it. It seems today we're witnessing a widespread return to religion, especially among young people, and particularly to traditional religion, though it's hard to know exactly how significant this is when compared to the overall numbers of those leaving religion or who identify as non-religious. But if you're watching this video, you're likely to be familiar with what I'm talking about. This seems to be largely driven by the felt lack of meaning offered by secular thought in society. It's from observing this in my own experience that I've noticed certain common phenomena. One of these is that a given religion, even before conversion or reconversion, becomes a center around which all things revolve and which appear to make sense of all things. Everything begins to be interpreted in terms of it. Its ultimate authority begins to be felt. I think this is especially so in the case of Christianity, which is so proudly and rigorously exclusivist, and which makes salvation dependent on faith, and even more so in Catholicism, which adds to this a magisterial authority crowned by the unitary imperial office of the Pope. Thus, because of the very way it presents itself and the force with which it does so, it appears as a center, as the center. Add to this the centuries of wisdom and aesthetic and ethical value that evolved within it, and compare it to the secular status quo, and it becomes almost resistible. The center becomes a vortex. Of course, there are other factors. Islam and Judaism are also exclusivist, and also present themselves as the center, although in different ways to Christianity and to each other. An important factor is obviously one's own cultural influences and the milieu in which one was raised. Jews are returning to traditional Judaism, and Muslims to traditional Islam, and I'm sure this phenomenon of center or vortex is also true for them. But the question here is, to what extent is this phenomenon a reflection of the true state of affairs, that the religion is indeed the objective center of meaning and authority, or to what extent is the appearance of this due to extraneous factors, some of which we've mentioned? It's also possible to look at the world in a very different way, where there are countless different relative centers, many different glimpses of, approaches to, instantiations of the good and the true. Seeing the world in this way, the pull of the vortex of a single religion considerably slackens. This is in some ways, of course, less ideal. It makes one, in a certain sense, homeless. The meaning of the world isn't clear and predefined. Nevertheless, we needn't equate this with nihilism. If one loves wisdom, one finds it in abundance. The challenge is then to comprehend all these disparate glimpses of it, to bring them together in an intelligible whole, as far as one is able, and to push forward into discovering more and more of it. It is to take responsibility for thinking and for the worldview one holds. There are unique detriments and dangers here, of course, and one misses out on the specific benefits of the religious sacrificium intellectus. But I would argue that a full embrace of religion, whether one represents this as the sacrifice of the intellect or its fulfillment, is far more elusive than we think. A friend of mine recently articulated the paradox of the religious convert. They chose that religion. They know that they chose. They know that they exercised this ultimate authority to decide upon fundamental matters. So even if they go as far as sacrificing their individual will and intellect, they know they chose to do this too, for specific reasons, that they wanted to do this, and therefore that at any point they can take it back. Thus, a particular kind of intense individualism underlies such conversions, and so conditions the character of religious belief. One employs one's will and intellectual talents to creatively, uniquely, originally argue for the truth and sensibleness of every established doctrine. Or one subtly undermines the doctrines or practices of that faith in service to one's own intellectual or personal predilections, all while insisting that these conclusions are orthodox and rigorously follow from that faith. Or one argues for the primacy of authority, dogma, community, tradition, in some ingenious paradoxical way, while relishing the subversiveness of this amid a liberal society and the unique strength of one's own apparent violence against oneself. But in all of this, the individual idiosyncratic self is alive and well and flourishing. Now the situation is undoubtedly different. Now the situation is undoubtedly different for someone born into a faith amidst a believing society, or someone who converts for practical reasons, or even for someone who converts for intensely emotional reasons and doesn't care much for the intellectual. So in these cases, I'm not saying that what I've said applies there. This is a different situation. But for someone whose conversion or return to religion is mediated by the intellect, I do think that this basic paradox obtains, and it appears this was the case with Scheler a century before us. To put it rather starkly, for the sake of illustration, it was that brilliant, proud, erotic self that embraced Catholicism, used Catholicism, and then discarded and moved beyond it. But that may be putting it too starkly, because it ignores the redemptive factor of philosophy, love of wisdom, love of being. These are not amenable to the same selfish dynamic, at least in the same way. While self-deception is always possible, a whole layer of the need for it is stripped away. What threat is it to me that my thought is ultimately bound by being itself? And it's up to me to discover where those limits lie. Isn't it rather a blessing and a delight? Doesn't then being itself become the center, though still obscured in so many ways? Yes, the individual self, the individual heart and mind must still be a center in a privileged way compared with its role in religion. It must take upon itself ultimate responsibility for uncovering the true center in being itself. So this is the case, I would say, in the way of philosophy. And this can lead to errors and aberrations, but it doesn't have to. And in any case, the same is true of religion. But for the reasons I've hinted at, the way of philosophy is nonetheless more honest and direct for those disposed to it. That philosophy is not nothing. That the dilemma is not between religion and nihilism is shown by the very fact that religion depends on philosophy. In the East, it was interwoven with it. And in the West, the three great religions, in the forms we know them today, were thoroughly conditioned by the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, which stood decisively outside religion. Christianity is the most striking example of this. Christianity is founded upon the brilliant, proud, erotic mind of Plato, a mind nonetheless in love with wisdom and being. And as for Jesus Christ, when we consider his sheer individuality, originality, and disregard for established authority when it came up against directly intuited truth, can we really separate him from the camp of the philosophers? We return to Scheler. He abandoned Christianity and continued to pursue his way as a pure philosopher, and began to develop a vision of being as he uniquely and honestly understood it. And in many ways, I think, this was an advance on the Christianity he left behind. And he seemed to gain spiritual sustenance from his philosophy and philosophizing, as Plato and Spinoza and Nietzsche did before him. But what about the reasons for his change? As I mentioned, I can only conclude that there were both personal and intellectual reasons for his break with the church. We can't ignore the one or the other. Scheler loved another woman and wanted to marry her, or at least didn't want to give her up, and the church would not allow it. But at the same time, he had long been meditating on the problem of reality and the problem of evil, and found the answers he had come to within the intellectual confines of the church to be deeply unsatisfying. The late philosophy of Scheler itself gives us the tools to understand this situation. In his essay, Problems of Sociology of Knowledge, first published in 1924, he distinguishes between determining factors and realizing factors to explain how ideas come to be realized in society. The determining factors are ideal or spiritual in nature, what would become his conception of Geist, and the realizing factors are themselves always real, the quote, drive-conditioned factors of life, what would become his drum. As we've seen, spirit by itself is powerless, so we might see his intellectual dissatisfaction with church doctrine as the determining factor, and his personal romantic situation as the realizing factor that led to his break with the church. Both are necessary to make sense of the change. We might object, but what led him to the church in the first place, if not the determining ideal factor of its wisdom? But if we examine the case more closely, things become a little less clear. After all, his first conversion to the church was when he was 14 years old, although there were the subtle arguments of the school chaplain. On page 4 of his biography, Stalder imagines other motivations. Quote, in the month of May, in many a church and square in Munich, the Catholic population of the city turned out in throngs for candlelight processions, litanies, and choral devotions to the Virgin Mary. At night, several of the young servant girls who worked for Uncle Hermann secretly took Scheler to observe the festivities. The fragrance of the incense and the Baroque splendor of the candlelight celebrations mingled with Scheler's affection for the young girls. The spirit of community that he saw in these religious festivities probably did as much as anything that the priest said to lead him out of Judaism into Catholicism." End quote. The factor of the erotic reappears later, in connection to his second conversion in 1915. He married the Catholic Mary, and in 1912, and while this may not have caused his reconversion, it certainly afforded it in a way that his earlier and subsequent marriages did not. Finally, in considering the relevance of the ideal factors, we should consider what Scheler didn't do after his break with the church. He could have become a Protestant, but he didn't. He could have become his own idiosyncratic brand of self-proclaimed Christian. He didn't. And he could have become an atheist, a nihilist, or a simple, genuine pantheist. He did none of these, but pursued his own specific philosophy in its own specific direction. So did Scheler fall away from Christianity or rise above it? In a way, we cannot know. If the ideal factors were good, the real factors were base. But we don't know the precise mix of ideal and real factors that led him to it in the first place. Where does this leave us? Well, I've made a case that Scheler's late philosophy itself isn't worse than the Christian worldview, and in many ways may be better. And it seems to me that the way of the philosopher of this basic orientation to being, independent of religious dogma, that this is a viable and valuable way, and may indeed be better than that of religious believer. But if I take these lessons from my study of Scheler, I also take the following: that we are bodily, driven and desiring, stubborn, proud, seeking and expressing and exercising power. This is, in a sense, unfortunate. But it is also fortunate, because it is the basis upon which anything is real, and the matrix within which the purest and loftiest ideas come to be real. We can only hope that this interpenetration of spirit and impulsion continues, and seek to further it in the ways that we can, so that each of us may become more wise and virtuous, and the world may come to take on more and more the character of the divine.